You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm sitting here with my friend and yours, Michael Kofman. Mike, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having me back.
So there's a lot of fixation, I think it's fair to say, on the forthcoming Ukrainian offensive. It seems to be all that everyone's talking about. Can you walk us through what's happening in the war and what you think about this looming offensive?
Sure. So I think at this stage, we're in a transitional period where the Russian winter offensive has largely petered out. Russian military did not achieve much in this operation. It expended manpower, material, and ammunition in exchange for very little in the way of gains. It looks like much of the Russian military switched to a defensive posture in anticipation of Ukraine offensive operation. Yes, they're still fighting around Bakhmut, and yes, Ukrainian forces have lost most of Bakhmut, but we've talked about that extensively in this podcast, and I don't feel a need to retread that ground. I think that it increasingly looks clear that the Ukrainian offensive operation, if it's going to take place, and if it's going to be this spring, then naturally it's likely going to happen at some point in May, although we don't know that for a fact. My own view is that the longer Ukraine waits, the better its odds of success, because there's a higher chance of putting together the equipment, have a longer timeline to train the requisite forces. And in terms of how we think about the offensive, it's much better that they wait and try to get this right than try to do an offensive early just to meet Western expectations or to change the narrative about stalemate or what have you. Regarding the offensive itself, it increasingly looks like the Ukrainian force consists of brigades that have been set aside that haven't been part of the fighting. Although it's not clear, it's clear that 9 brigades are being equipped by Western countries and are being trained by the West, and 3 brigades Ukraine is providing, and I'm not sure what they are or what they will ultimately consist of. And that Ukraine will receive some substantial amount of artillery ammunition, which will give it runway for an offensive operation of maybe several months in duration, depending on what it turns out to be. Beyond that, I think the real challenge, Ryan, is that this offensive increasingly looks like sort of, a set of shells loaded into a double-barrel shotgun, in the sense that what has been done provides Ukraine with a clear window of opportunity. And I think, the more time I've had to think on it, the more I become optimistic on the prospect that this offensive will make gains. But on the other hand, it's not a theory of victory, I think, that shows how the West will help sustain Ukraine in this war.
I've been kind of disappointed with the tone and tenor of leaks and off-the-record briefings from this administration, basically it almost seems like they're trying to wash their hands of what's happening in terms of the messaging, so they can say if it doesn't go well, we said it might not go well. If it does go well, they can say, well, this is only due to us. I was, particularly pointing to Alex Ward's newsletter in Politico that came out yesterday. I know that the administration's obviously been supporting Ukraine. We've been providing Ukraine with unprecedented amount of security aid, yada, yada, yada. But the messaging just seems kind of strange to me.
Right. It sounds like people are trying to hedge and are worried of having expectations stacked on top of this offensive. But that's happened by default, because the U.S. has not articulated a theory of success beyond this offensive operation. This offensive will test, a new approach this year, which is the combination of Western equipment together with Western training and Ukrainian forces that have been set aside for the operation, that have ideally not been participating in the fighting over the past several months. If that succeeds or doesn't succeed, either way, the big question is, well, what follows? Because what will likely follow is a prolonged period of attritional fighting like we've witnessed over the last 5 months. Even if the United States comes out next month and announces some new package, it'll still take months to transfer that equipment, train Ukrainian forces on it again. And so it feels as though there isn't a well-articulated strategy for the war, but just an articulated strategy of living one offensive to another offensive with substantial gaps in between, right? I'm kind of with you in that I think folks are trying to have it both ways. They're not willing to define what the criteria for success is in this operation. They also don't want to be blamed for its failure, right? And in the event it doesn't succeed. And they've sort of both levied expectations on top of a prospective offensive operation. And they're also trying to manage or limit expectations, despite the fact that there hasn't been a clear story as to what will follow this operation.
Yeah, and you could see they're trying to create some political trade space, which I don't really blame them for doing. It's, I guess, the tone of it. You can see how they want to be prepared for, is this offensive going to look like Kharkiv in one extreme, or Kherson, still a victory but a grinding one, or is it going to look more like Russia's offensive, which just sort of petered out, seized some territory but not very much, and at great cost, although imposing serious losses on the Ukraine. But you wonder, is this also just sort of hedging for all outcomes? Is this about creating a pathway to pressing for negotiations if this offensive doesn't go well? I'm just speculating here. I don't expect you to have all the answers, but just throwing some stuff out there for you to react to.
Sure. So first, on the offensive itself, I think it's going to look closer to Kherson and Kharkiv, but it's going to be very much its own operation, and it's going to be different from the two we saw in the fall. I think, in general, I'm loath to make predictions, but here in particular, my honest answer is that this force is actually a fairly new force with Western equipment and training, and has not been tested in operation before. And the Russian military on the other side is a set of mobilized units in entrenchments that they've built over the course of the winter, and it hasn't been seriously tested on the defense either. And I think it's important to reframe this discussion from sort of thinking as though we've seen the Russian-Ukrainian military fight over the past year, but in practice, these militaries have changed significantly from the start of this war, and we're going to see two forces go up against each other again this year that in some ways aren't really tested. That's why it's hard to predict how it will go. My suspicion is there'll be a series of operations playing out over the course of several months. And that the big question is not whether Ukraine can break through the first Russian line, but whether they can sustain momentum in operation, right? On, criteria for success or failure, my answer is kind of, I guess we'll know it when we see it, but people have been so reticent to offer a clear criteria for success. The thing analysts tend to select for, because we do have selection bias, is territory trading hands. But that's kind of like the dependent variable that is, it's the lagging indicator of what's happening between the two forces, right? So to me, whether or not significant territory trades hands in this offensive operation is the thing we will focus on, what the media will focus on, but it might not be the most important factor, right?
It is and it isn't, right? It's like Schrodinger's important factor, right? Because it's actually supremely important because it will determine the political narrative, which will then determine the shape and nature and amount of Western support going forward. But you're right, is the real action is what's happening to the two forces.
So it's very significant when it comes to Ukraine galvanizing further Western support, right? Because if this offensive is perceived as unsuccessful, and that's the problem with subjective measures, right? Like, I don't know what British or French or Germans think is the measure of success for this offensive relative to us. I just don't know. And it feels like it's going to be subjective relative to people's expectations, not that no one has drawn a line, a map, and said, if Ukraine gets to this point, if they get to Melitopol, this is success. But if they only get to Tokmak, this is failure. I'm just throwing out two cities, by the way. Don't listen to this and write this down as a concrete criteria. All right, so no one has put this out there, so we can't measure it in this manner. On the other hand, let me give you this scenario to just react to. This is the challenge of military victory versus political victory. So even though this offensive was wildly successful, let's just say hypothetically Ukraine retakes all territory except for Crimea in the next 3 months. I don't see how this war ends. I see it just going on as a cross-border war of attrition between two states, right? So, sure, lots of people will say that's a good problem to have for Ukraine. Ukraine's political objectives are tied to territorial control on the one hand. But I actually think that after this offensive operation, no matter how it goes, we will begin to see a schism and an interesting discussion between those policy elites and decision makers who are interested in the Ukrainian victory and those who are interested in an end to this war. Because successful or not, this offensive by itself is very unlikely to end the war. And the question will be what follows. And so far, I haven't heard a great story about what the U.S. plan is or U.S. strategy following this offensive.
Mike, taking a quick break from the conversation, you just recorded a new episode of the Russia Contingency, your members-only show. Can you talk a little bit about what that was on?
On the Russia Contingency, I'm also taking a bit of a break from the present and going back to talking to some of my favorite historians or historians I've recently discovered. And I have a fantastic conversation with Alexander Burns. He's a historian on the period of Kabinetskrieg. And we delve into the history of the Russian military, where some Russian military traditions or aspects of culture stem from. What was the Russian army like in the 1700s and 1800s? Is the Russian military historically, technologically backwards? Is it overly dependent on mass? Or are those stereotypes that have been generated largely in the 20th century? We talk a bit about the Battle of Bakhmut. There's the Battle of Bakhmut in 1708, the first Battle of Bakhmut that I know everybody's interested in hearing about. We talk a bit about what Potemkin's army really was, and was it a cliche that is often used to show that something is farcical and lacking in substance, or was Potemkin's army actually a very good army? So if you're interested in that, and you're interested in the history of the Russian military and how it relates to the war in Ukraine today, then I hope you'll tune in and check out this episode.
Great. Now let's get back to present-day Ukraine. I'd like to talk with you a bit about how we can expect Ukraine to fight in this offensive. You and Rob and others, Conrad, Franz, have talked about how this is a very different Ukrainian army than the one that was fighting early in the war. A lot of older people have been mobilized, people that had experience when it was still sort of more of a Soviet or Soviet-like, or actual Soviet or Soviet-like army. And so the way that it's fought in some ways has become more like the Russian force in terms of these sort of grinding war of attrition, artillery heavy. Part of this is a result of, as I was talking about with General Brown, the Air Force Chief of Staff, just the result of having no air superiority, so it becomes a grinding World War I style fight. But this is also to do with Ukrainian choices on how to fight. What can we expect in the offensive? Should we expect more dynamic and modern and Western, dare I say, tactics and methods of fighting, or should we expect more of the same, what we've seen in and around Bakhmut?
Well, so I think the U.S. hope is that Ukraine will be able to engage in, to some extent, combined arms maneuver, that it's going to be a more efficient approach that will privilege maneuver over fires. Ukraine is a fires-driven military, just like the Russian military. They're both successors to the Soviet military, which is a successor to the Russian Imperial Army. Culturally, these are artillery armies. I think these brigades that Ukraine has set aside, they are a combination of mechanized and motorized brigades, and they would privilege mobility. They look fairly thin, actually, on artillery support. And in general, it's been clear in public reporting that Ukraine has often teetered between having a shortage of available barrels to a shortage of available ammunition, and it's been experiencing a whole period or phase of shell hunger over the course of this winter. So one of the biggest questions will be, is the U.S. theory going to be proven out in this operation? Can Western training enable Ukraine to fight differently, to fight more perhaps like the United States would like them to? And I think this is a fair point. The U.S., whenever it trains people, it very quickly tries to train them to fight the way the U.S. military would. And the challenge with that is the U.S. military is very used to fighting with air superiority, with air power delivering a lot of firepower to the battlefield, and with U.S. logistics and U.S. enablers, right? And the challenge for Ukraine, we'll put aside the air superiority conversation, so they don't have U.S. logistics or U.S. enablers, and they do not have quite the experience in operating as brigades. The U.S. fights as brigade combat teams, right? And Ukraine will often fight as battalions or elements of brigades coordinated, the operational level command. So this is going to be another test for them in terms of their ability to scale an operation.
Hi, this is Aaron Stein. 2 commercials in one episode? I know. But listen to this, and we'll get back to Mike Kofman on Ukraine in a second. I'm going to be quick. Earlier in this episode, you heard Ryan mention his conversation with General C.Q. Brown, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. That was the last episode of the War on the Rocks podcast, the one right before this one. They talked about a whole lot of things, but one of those things was combat collaborative aircraft, which is a new Air Force concept about using high-tech ways to get more iron in the sky. I'll let General Brown explain.
And the way we're going to look at the collaborative combat aircraft and what we have in this particular budget is focused on 3 lines of effort. First is the platform itself. So, what is the platform that's going to actually do the work? And then there's aspects of autonomy. Because the goal is how do you put into that platform levels of autonomy that take the pressure off the crewed aircraft? And then there's the organizational construct as the last line of effort.
So why do I raise this? We have a new episode of Unspent Rounds coming out next week with Andrew Scar Van Timmeren, a former F-22 pilot in the U.S. Air Force who's been involved in combat collaborative aircraft for a long time. Unspent Rounds is one of 4 members-only shows. Here's a preview of that conversation.
Why do we need to darken the skies with 1,000 of these collaborative combat aircraft? It really is because the engagement that we see coming in hope to deter against the pacing threat of China is extremely high risk. It's extremely high risk.
If you're an air power nerd like me, you'll want to listen to this. It's blissfully acronym-free and a great episode. So become a member at warontherocks.com/membership. Okay, back to Mike and Ryan.
The Russian military has shown that they really lack offensive potential. They're currently at a place where they are not capable of large-scale combat operations. They are only able to attack with assault groups and detachments, and try to press Ukrainian forces out of a particular area or city or town, but that they're not able to scale up their offensive potential to a major offensive. That's the reality. And I'm actually very skeptical on Russia's ability to conduct offensives in general moving forward this year unless they conduct another major mobilization wave. The jury is still out, I think, on what Ukraine can do with Western equipment and training and a significant infusion of ammunition. So I think optimistically, Ukrainian forces will demonstrate that they can that they can not just break through, but maintain some kind of momentum, which was very difficult for them to do in Kherson. It was easy for them to do in Kharkiv, but we know the reasons why. And those structural reasons might be difficult to replicate in this case.
And for those who want to revisit what Mike and I had to say about Kharkiv right after it happened, I believe that episode came out sometime in earlier mid-September. It must have been. We were in Rhode Island, so that's when we recorded that. Mike, thanks for joining. So this is going to be a shorter episode, I think, because we want to keep it at what level of interesting things we actually have to say rather than keep talking for another 10 minutes when you and I don't have too much more to add. So this is really, in some sense, the calm before the storm. So I expect the next few episodes that we record will be much longer because we'll have a lot more to talk about. But in the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy, and of course, become a War on the Rocks member so you can listen to Mike's show, The Russia Contingency, as well as The Warcast, Unspent Rounds, The Insider, read Nick Danforth's great cartographic newsletter. What other website offers a cartographic newsletter? You are a member at warontherocks.com/membership.